So have you ever wondered if it would be quicker to cut your petals using a cutting machine rather than by hand? Hi, I'm Michelle from How Muchly Paper Blooms, and today I have 12 tips on how to use a Cricut Maker for making your paper flowers. So before I ever tried using a cutting machine for my petals, I used to wonder how people do this so fast. Some paper florists seem to cut their petals out so quickly. And also when you look at the prices that people sell their flowers for, you think, well, they can't possibly be making a profit if they're taking as long to cut petals out as I am. So there's a few things I've learned along the way that do speed up the process of cutting them by hand. And I've covered those in a previous video, so if you want to check that out, I'll link it above and below. But one of the other things that I've learned along my journey as a paper florist is to use a cutting machine sometimes. Now, I don't recommend that you do this all the time. And I definitely don't recommend you do it when it's with big petals that you'll maybe only fit, I don't know, 4 or 5 to a page. And in that situation, I 100% recommend that you stick to cutting out with scissors. However, there are circumstances when it makes a lot more sense to use a cutting machine. And that's what I want to touch on today. So stick with me, I have 12 tips for you today on how to use a cutting machine. In particular, I'm going to talk about the Cricut Maker because that is the one that I have. I haven't ever used another cutting machine other than the other Cricuts. So I've used the Cricut Explorer before, but that one doesn't work with Crepe paper. So today I'm going to talk about the Cricut Maker. And I assume most of these tips will transfer to other cutting machines, but I'm not an authority on that, so I'm not going to talk about it. But please try them. If you have one of the other cutting machines and you want to try these and see if they work, I'd love to get some feedback so I can help others out if they do have that same machine too. So just let me know in the comments below if you have any feedback on that. And also if you do try using a Cricut Maker and use these tips, I'd love to hear how you get on and whether you think it's worth it to cut with machine or if you prefer to stick to cutting by hand. So yeah, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your feedback on that. So now I want to jump into some tips on how to use your Cricut as well. So let's get to it. So the first tip is to pick and choose when you use a Cricut Maker. Don't necessarily do every single petal using the machine and don't necessarily do every single petal by hand. There are circumstances where it makes a lot more sense to use either option. So a lot of that depends on the flower that you're making and how quickly that you need it to be made. And also just taking into account your personal circumstances as well. Personally, I find it depends on the flower that I'm making, which is the best method to use. And also, particularly how many I'm making. So if you're making a lot of flowers, or particularly something that's quite intricate with lots of small details, if you're making 1 or 2 of them, it's probably not the end of the world. Like you can just cut them out by hand and they're a bit fiddly, but it's okay. And it might take a little bit longer to cut than you'd like. However, if you're making, say, 10 or 20 of a flower, which might sound a lot, but if you're doing any kind of wedding flowers or any kind of event or backdrop, or even just if you want to make a big bunch of flowers for at home, quite often you're going to have a lot of the same flower, and therefore you're going to be cutting out lots and lots and lots of the same petals. And it doesn't take very much for that to get boring very quickly. So partly these tips today will hopefully save your sanity. But also the main reason that I find it works best is because your hands really do start to hurt over time. So I like to use these sort of scissors, the ones with the spring action, and they don't have the thumb holes. So first of all, that doesn't rub into your hands as you're cutting. But even with these, with this spring that's like assists in the cutting, your hands can easily start to hurt quite quickly. And that repetitive motion of cutting out 20 odd flowers at a time, or even over the space of several days, can start to really hurt your hands. And you have to be wary about anything like repetitive strain injury and things like that. So particularly if you have arthritis or any kind of other conditions in your hands, then using something like the Cricut Maker is going to really help you with that. So it might not necessarily be the quickest, but it will save your health. So in my eyes, that's definitely worth it. So obviously the benefits of this are saving your sanity and saving your health. And that's 2 pretty big ones in my opinion. So quite often it is quicker to cut out the bigger petals by hand than it is by machine. So in that situation, there's 2 things you can do. You can either just cut them by hand and have done with it, they're quicker, or you just accept that it might take a little bit longer, but whilst that's cutting, you can be doing something else. So your machine can be sat off to the side, doing its thing, whilst you're working on another flower. So I want to encourage you to think about it differently. It's not necessarily you sat there waiting for the Cricut to finish doing its thing. You are setting it going and going off and you're working on another flower. So the time that you're spending is only actually the time to set up the machine and then to remove them from the mat afterwards. The actual time of cutting, you're doing something else anyway. So just adjust your thinking to that, and hopefully that will help you to make a decision which is the best method for you. So you may already know this if you've had a play with a Cricut already. So you need to use the Cricut Maker and not the other models of Cricut. Only the Cricut Maker is the one that will cut crepe paper. So there's the standard Maker, which is the one I have, which is one of the earlier editions. And then they recently brought out the Maker 3, which has a lot more features as well. And that does a whole host of other things, but that specifically also works with crepe paper. So any of the Maker models will be the ones you need. You also need a rotary blade, and I believe they now come as standard. When I bought mine, I had to buy it separately, but I think they now come with most of the Maker models. So you need to use a rotary blade. And then in terms of your mats, you can use one of two mats. So a lot of people like to use this pink fabric mat, and that one is designed for these kind of materials. So this is probably your safest bet. However, the other option is to use the strong grip mat, which is this one, the purple one. I wouldn't use a brand new one of these, maybe one that's slightly older, because then there's a little bit less stickiness on there. But I found this one works really well as well. So I would use either the pink fabric mat or the purple strong grip. The other thing I want to touch on is about cleaning your mat. Over time, it'll get like little bits of crepe paper, and you can see this one has little white pieces because I've cut some standard paper on it. So the easiest way to clean them, believe it or not, is just some water and dish soap. And you can get your mats like new by washing them. Honestly, the stickiness comes back. It's crazy how it works. I don't understand it, but it does. So all you need to do is use a cloth. I recommend like this kind of like microfiber cloth that's got the texture to it. These work brilliantly, and you'll be amazed how quickly and easily it cleans it up. So just wet the cloth, add a little bit of either dish soap or hand soap works as well, and then just rub all of the bits of paper and anything off until it's clean. Rinse it under the tap again, and then leave it to air dry without the protective film on. Just leave that to air dry on the side, or you can use a hairdryer if you're in a rush. And then once that's completely dry, it will have all of its stickiness back again. It is literally like a brand new mat, and it's amazing how it works. So I recommend that you make sure your mat is clean before you start. So if you have the little small tiny pieces like this is not going to affect your cut. But if you've got anything bigger left on the mat, that's going to stop your crepe paper sticking to the mat, and then it'll move around as it's cutting. So just make sure your mat is nice and clean to start with. So tip number 3 is to always use stretched out crepe paper. So obviously this depends on the flower that you're making, if you can do this or not, which is another thing to take into account when you're deciding if you're cutting with a maker or by hand. So most leaves and foliage, you'll probably end up using stretched crepe paper whichever way you cut them, because you don't really want too much stretch in that paper anyway once you cut it. So for something like a foliage stem, this is perfect. And any of the smaller petals that you want them to be stretched out to start with, then this is the one you want to use. If you're not stretching the crepe paper, it may still work. However, it is more likely to not stick to the mat. So in that situation, I would definitely use the strong grip mat. But ideally, I would recommend that you stretch out your crepe paper to at least 90%. So number 4, you probably already can guess this one. You need to stick down your paper really, really well. So obviously you've already stretched out your crepe paper. So I always start from the top left corner, because that's where the Cricut will start cutting from. And then follow the measurements across the top and the side so that you're lining up the paper with each edge, and then basically smooth it out this way. So you need to smooth it down really, really well. And just take your time to really stretch out the crepe, smooth it by hand, push out any air bubbles. You don't want any bubbles left in there. You can use this tool that comes with the Cricut. You can also do it by hand. You can use any kind of flat surface you've got lying around to really put pressure and smooth out any air bubbles. Any bubbles that are left in the paper are going to ruin the cut. So make sure that you really take your time to do this and make sure it's really well stuck down. Also to bear in mind, if you get any creases in the paper, which is quite possible because you're stretching it, just lift it up and then re-stick those without the creases. So although they probably will still cut, you'll be left with a jagged edge where the crease was, that you might have to then go back in and trim by hand. So just try to smooth that out as well as you can before you get started. So the other thing that you can do if you're really struggling to get your crepe paper to stick, so this is going to be particular if you're not using stretched out crepe paper, or if your mat has lost some of its stickiness, you can use regular tape to hold it down as well. Now this is not the best method, but it will help you out if you're struggling. So there's a few things to bear in mind. Always make sure that you're sticking your tape outside of the sticky edge. So the stickiness goes up to this ruler line on each side. So don't put any tape on this bit because it's a nightmare to remove it. Make sure it's just on the smooth, unsticky plastic area around the outside. But you can do a few pieces or a long strip, but make sure that you do it on all 4 sides of the crepe paper. And like I say, that's only really an issue if you haven't stretched out your crepe paper very well. So personally, I tend to only use that if I have to. So generally I won't use the tape unless I'm having issues. Number 6 is to arrange your petals to make the best use of the crepe paper. And I'm also going to touch on number 7 now as well, because they're kind of linked. So number 7 is to make sure that the lines on your template line up with the grain lines of the paper. So the standard Cricut mat is 12 inches by 12 inches square. Depending which paper you use, you might not be able to use the full mat. So the German heavyweight crepe, which is the one I usually use, that is only 10 inches tall. So if you have the grain lines running top to bottom, then it's 10 inches top to bottom, and obviously as wide as you cut the paper to be. Obviously other types of paper will be bigger, but specifically I'll focus on that one because that's the one that's more affected by the height, and also most of my tutorials are using that one too. So if you are using the same paper as me, this is something to bear in mind. So you'll either be using your own template or one that you've had from somebody else. So if you've got one of my templates, then generally it should be set up right anyway, so don't need to worry about it. But if you're creating your own or you have somebody else's, make sure that the template is set up so that your petals are not going to get chopped off the paper. So the Cricut will assume that your paper is 12 by 12 because that's the size of the mat. You can set it up so that it takes a photo of the paper that you have available and then it works around that. But as standard, it will just assume it's 12 by 12. So there's various different file types that you can use with the Cricut. If you're using my templates, then I set those up as an SVG file, which is what the cutting machines use as the preferred method, basically. You obviously can use like a JPEG, a PDF, PNG, whatever you want, but there's just a few more steps to remove the backgrounds then. So although when I've made the template, I have, let's say, 50 petals on there, on one sheet, and I will do the layout so that it fits within that 12 by 10 space we have available. Within the design space, it will be one kind of group of petals. And you can then click on each individual layer and move them if you want to, but it will bring it in as a group so that you can easily move it around to start with, okay? So then when you go to actually prepare your cut, you can actually then click on each petal individually to move it around so that it best fits your paper. So let's say you've got an 11-inch wide piece of crepe, which is going to come to here. If you've got a petal designed to sit in this 12-inch square here, it's going to keep cutting even though there's no paper there, which is fine as a one-off. But if you're doing lots and lots of this same template and you're just going to keep putting this same mat back in, eventually you're going to cut through the mat in this space. And it does take a while, but trust me, I've done it before. It does happen. So what I recommend you do is to just adjust to the SVG file in that case. So you can just literally click onto the petal and then drag that to another place on the paper. Or if your paper is even smaller, you don't have space for that, then you can set it up to go onto the next sheet instead. And one of the great things about using the Cricut for this is that obviously you can push the petals very close together, probably closer than you can do if you do it by hand. But it is a lot more tricky to make the best use of your paper by hand than it is with Cricut. So by doing it with the Cricut, you're getting rid of all that dead space, the machine is very precise and it's doing all the hard work for you. So in theory, you should be using a lot less crepe paper by doing it this way. So as I touched on before, number 7 is to make sure that the template lines line up. So most templates will have something that indicates the direction of the grain lines in the paper. So on my templates, it's these 3 little lines here, and that indicates that you want the grain in the paper to run top to bottom. So when I say that the grain line runs top to bottom, I mean this way here. So this grain line runs in this direction. And that will make sure that everything's stretching in the way that it should. And also for any flowers or leaves that use the grain line as part of the design, they're going to sit in the right position too. So that's something to bear in mind if you're creating your own templates. So Cricut will sometimes automatically move the shape to best suit the paper. So if you just have individual shapes within your design space, when you go to the mat to cut it, so it might rotate it because then it can fit more petals on that same sheet of paper. It obviously doesn't know that you want it in a certain direction. So if you do create your own template or you receive one that it's not set up in this way, what you need to do is go back into design space, lay it out as you want it to appear on the page, and then select all of your layers and then you attach them together. So that will arrange them on the mat exactly as per your layout within Design Space. So moving on to actually cutting the crepe paper, the settings that I find to work the best is to use the standard crepe paper setting. That's just set up in the preset modes, but then make sure you change the drop down menu to the option that says more, and that just gives it a bit more pressure as it's cutting. And in my experience, that works the best. Okay, so number 9, we need to get our petals off the mat. So there's a few ways you can do it. A lot of people recommend that you pull the mat away from the paper, not the paper away from the mat, which I do agree with. However, when you're using very small petals, that's not really possible. So it does depend on the size of your petal. And also, because we're probably going to shape the paper anyway, it doesn't matter too much if it does bend, because it's just the nature of the paper flower. So don't worry too much if you can't do that. So if you're using smaller petals, then there's 2 tools that I recommend that you use. So these both come as part of the standard Cricut one. So there's this little hook tool. I believe it's called a weeder, but either way, it's the one with the hook. And that's really good for just gently lifting up the edge of the paper. So you can either then pull that up by hand, or this one's quite a good one to kind of get underneath and gently like prise it up. It does depend how well stuck down it is. So if you're using one of the really sticky, strong grip mats that's like brand new, you're probably not going to get underneath it with this, which is one of the reasons I say not to use the brand new ones. But this works really well to be like a gentle lift if you don't want to warp the paper at all. If you use this hook too much, you will start to find that your paper wobbles a bit and gets a few ridges in it. So use this one to start with, but be very careful with it. And then move on to use this as soon as you can. Or, like I say, just by hand, you can just lift it up by hand. Particularly if you've got long nails, that you'll find it a lot easier. So, number 10, you might find there are a few tiny little bits that your Cricut doesn't cut properly. So most of the time, this is not an issue. Almost always, it does cut through the paper properly. But if you're finding there's like a tiny little bit that hasn't quite cut, and you know that if you pull on the paper, that's going to tear it, just stop where you are and use a craft knife. So this is just a standard like craft blade. Just cut through that tiny little piece that hasn't quite cut properly. So it might not be quite the same shape, there might be a little bit of a difference, but you know that you're not going to lose your petal. So it is worth using a craft knife for that. So number 11, it might seem obvious, but you never know. If you're going to add any paints or pastels to your paper, do it afterwards. So if you are going to use alcohol inks to stain or dye your paper, then you can definitely do that first. I do that all the time and it works fine. But if you're going to use any kind of acrylic paint or pan pastels or even any spray paint, then do that after you've cut your petals. So if you put in pastels, for example, onto your paper and then putting that paper onto the mat, you're going to transfer all of the pastel onto the mat instead, and it's just going to leave you a huge mess on your mat and take you a lot longer to clean it, and then you'll probably have to redo the colour on the petals anyway. So just save that until after you cut your petals out. And then the final tip is, if your paper isn't sticking, if you're struggling with it, if it's not working for any reason, try a different paper. So again, it probably sounds obvious, but the thicker papers don't stick as well to the mats. So you've got to be careful what paper you're using. So if you've watched any of my other videos, you probably already know that my preference is a heavyweight German crepe paper, and that works perfectly stretched out on these mats. So all of these tips today that you'll see, I'm using that paper. But you can obviously use other types of crepe paper. So personally, I've not had any joy using 180 gram Italian crepe paper on these mats. The ridges in that paper are quite a lot deeper, and also the paper itself is thicker. So even if you're stretching it out completely, it's still not quite stuck as well as it would be with the other paper. So that's not to say it won't work, but you just need to use some of these tips to make sure it's really well stuck down. But if you are finding that even after using the tips it's still not sticking, then I recommend you switch down to a thinner paper. So either try the German, which is very similar in the result that you'll end up with when you finish flower, or even try one of the thinner papers as well. So the lightweight crepe paper, some of the doublets, any of those should work well with the Cricut Maker. And there we go. So hopefully you found those tips useful, and I hope I've inspired you to give it a go to try a Cricut Maker. If you don't already have one at home, there are a lot of places that have them that you can rent them for an hour or so. So a lot of libraries do have them that you can rent them out, or art studios. So have a look in your local area and see if you can rent access to one before you go ahead and purchase, because they're not a cheap machine to buy. and you want to make sure that you're actually going to enjoy using it and it's going to be the right thing for you. I will also say they are great for any kind of craft projects. So if you're someone that enjoys any other crafts, they are brilliant for that, and you'd be amazed of all the different things you can make on them, especially the Maker as opposed to the other models like the Explorer, the Air, because it cuts a lot more materials. And they're great for like kids' school projects and things like that as well. So if you do decide that you want to get yourself a Cricut Maker, I'll pop a link below for you, which is one of my affiliate links. So this video is not sponsored by Cricut, but I do have an affiliate link for them, which means that if you do click on that link and then go ahead and purchase, I get a very tiny percentage of that, which helps me to keep bringing you these videos. It won't cost you any more, and actually it might even cost you a little bit less, because I'm going to keep this link up to date. I quite often get a notification from them about sales on the Maker and other products, so I will keep that link up to date every time there's a new sale on, so that if you're watching this in the future rather than the day it goes live, then hopefully you will get one of the sale prices instead. So it would really help me out if you could click on that link rather than just going direct to the Cricut website. And as I say, it won't cost you any extra at all, and it just means that I can hopefully keep bringing you more and more of these tutorials. So I hope I have inspired you to give it a try cutting with a Cricut Maker. Quite a few people have said to me recently that they're interested in trying it, so I'm going to try and do more templates which include Cricut templates as well. And I have a few fun Cricut testing ideas coming up as well, so keep an eye out for those. If you do have any questions about any of the tips today, or if you need some help using the Cricut Maker with your crepe paper, then let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to help you out. Make sure that you're subscribed to my channel so that you get notified when the next video goes live. And also don't forget you can join my email list at tamuchleypaperblooms.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, which is tamuchley_paperblooms. Until next time, happy flower making.